Welcome to the debate.
Thank you. A really fascinating subject for us today.
It really is. We're looking at what has to be one of the biggest biological anomalies in modern health science. The case of Warren Buffett. I mean, here we have a man well into his mid-90s, still showing exceptional cognitive function, still managing a massive enterprise, and yet his lifestyle is, well, it's famously non-traditional, almost childlike. We're talking 5 cans of Coca-Cola every day, high sugar, high sodium, very little traditional exercise. It violates nearly every single tenet of conventional public health.
Right. The Buffett paradox, as it's been called. It really forces you to reevaluate what we mean by healthy aging. Because if our current models are correct, he shouldn't be thriving at all. He should have succumbed to some form of metabolic disease decades ago.
Exactly. And so that brings us to our central question for today. Does Warren Buffett's longevity and his sustained cognitive sharpness, does it primarily validate the power of unique, unreplicable genetic resilience and, of course, immense socioeconomic privilege, or does it actually demonstrate the superiority of his counter-conventional lifestyle habits, things like his deep reading, his consistent sleep, his radical approach to stress modulation? Is that a robust, maybe even a transferable model for healthy aging?
And I'll be arguing that his sustained health is not just some genetic fluke. I believe it's a powerful testament to a very rigorous, non-traditional mental and emotional discipline, and that these specific habits create a kind of psychosocial buffer that I think successfully counteracts his dietary choices, making them the replicable key to his resilience.
Public. His diet is, clinically speaking, a metabolic hazard, and his vitality is primarily a function of winning the genetic jackpot and enjoying the unique privileges that come with elite healthcare and total financial autonomy.
So I'm suggesting that the active choices he makes day to day might just outweigh the passive luck of his birth.
Well, from my position, we have to start with the objective, clinical reality of his intake. I mean, the simple fact that he can maintain his health while consuming 5 12-ounce cans of Coca-Cola daily. For most people, that's a statistical impossibility. That alone is roughly 700 calories and about 165 grams of refined sugar. For an average person, this chronic influx of fructose, it places immense, sustained stress on the liver. It rapidly promotes de novo lipogenesis, which is the creation of new fat in the liver, and that leads directly to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, systemic inflammation, and, eventually insulin resistance and cardiovascular problems.
So you're describing the expected pathological cascade for the general population.
Precisely. And the fact that this pathology hasn't materialized in him suggests there's a significant biological firewall at play. And this is where the genetic argument becomes so compelling. His mother and his sister both lived well into their 90s, which indicates a clear, maybe generational predisposition for longevity. He likely possesses some of these rare longevity genes, like variations of FOXO3 or SIRT1. These are often called repair genes, and they're linked to highly efficient DNA maintenance and superior cellular stress resistance. It's like a metabolic shield that protects him from the very damage that those 165 grams of sugar should be causing. He's operating under a different biological rulebook, a rulebook shared by maybe 5% of the population.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that the mental optimization he engages in is a form of active, psychological, genetic expression? I'm just not convinced that his health is purely a function of inherited luck, because that dismisses the active, deliberate choices he makes every single day to optimize his mind. And that mental optimization is, I would argue, more rigorous and disciplined than any caloric restriction diet.
But mental discipline doesn't stop lipogenesis.
It absolutely regulates the systems that exacerbate it. I think his success is built on this non-negotiable commitment to psychosocial homeostasis. Just consider his primary protective factors, which often get dismissed as secondary. He guarantees 8 hours of sleep, every night. Now, this isn't just rest. This strict discipline optimizes the glymphatic system, which, clears metabolic waste from the brain and regulates hormonal balance, including cortisol and insulin sensitivity.
I agree sleep is foundational, but many highly disciplined people sleep well and they still suffer the metabolic consequences of a diet high in processed foods.
But Buffett doesn't just sleep, he cultivates what I'd call intense cognitive compounding. He dedicates 80% of his workday, that's 5 to 6 hours, to deep reading and focused thinking. He consumes 500 to 600 pages of material a day. This continuous, focused mental stimulation, it fosters extreme neuroplasticity and builds an immense cognitive reserve. He maintains this challenge with activities like playing bridge, which he says provides a new intellectual problem every 7 minutes. This acts as a potent, lifelong prophylactic against age-related cognitive decline. It effectively keeps his brain young, which is fundamentally linked to systemic health.
And how does that connect to his dietary resilience?
Well, most critically, he practices this profound stress modulation through his inner scorecard philosophy. This means he values his own judgment, his personal integrity, and long-term principles far above external market validation or peer pressure. This actively filters out the vast majority of high-stakes corporate anxiety and that chronic urgency stress that just plagues other C-suite executives. That emotional clarity has tangible protective physiological effects, reducing the constant low-level systemic inflammation that's driven by chronic cortisol exposure.
Okay, let's turn to our first point of contention then. The metabolic reality of that diet versus this proposed psychosocial buffer. We have public health experts universally cautioning against mimicking this regimen. The risk of systemic failure is just too high. You acknowledge the sugar load, but let's not forget the sodium, which he famously applies to food like a snowstorm. This combination is, frankly, medically irresponsible for a man in his 90s. The risks of hypertension, renal stress, chronic inflammation, they're all clear. You can't just discount the physical damage caused by these metabolic risks by saying his happiness negates them.
I do appreciate the need for clinical vigilance with sodium and sugar, but the clinical view so often fails to account for the comprehensive interaction of mind and body. Buffett's approach is rooted in his stated philosophy of seeking joy. He famously checked the actuarial tables, saw the lowest death rate was among 6-year-olds, and so he decided to eat like one. More profoundly, he once said that if someone told him he'd live an extra year by eating nothing but broccoli, he'd choose to, and I quote, "take a year off the end of my life and let me eat what I like."
It highlights a profound acceptance of risk, certainly, and a prioritizing of immediate satisfaction. But as public health advocates, we simply cannot endorse a philosophy that equates personal joy with chronic disease risk, especially when that risk is so extraordinarily high for most people.
But that quote highlights that the joy and the happiness derived from his preferred food are themselves a critical component of his anti-inflammatory defense. Are you setting up a false dichotomy here? The key isn't negating the laws of metabolism. It's about mitigating the chronic physiological harm that stress exacerbates. When a high-profile, high-stakes leader manages to keep his chronic cortisol levels low through rigorous emotional discipline, well, that in itself has a measurable impact on inflammation, on vascular health, and even on telomere length.
That's a powerful claim, that happiness fundamentally buffers against refined sugar. I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. Because while stress reduction is of course beneficial, it doesn't negate the body's need to process a constant, overwhelming amount of fructose. Fructose must be metabolized by the liver, and if his genes were merely average, the constant demands of lipogenesis would lead to mitochondrial dysfunction, regardless of how calm his inner scorecard is. His resilience is the reason why stress doesn't overwhelm his already stressed system, not the other way around.
But you're assuming the stress he avoids is minor? I would argue the psychological and corporate stress he intentionally filters out, the urgency, the external judgment, the multitasking, is a far greater source of systemic wear and tear than his breakfast choices. We have to weigh the quantifiable harm of chronic cortisol and sympathetic nervous system overdrive against the marginal risk of his diet, especially if we assume his genetic predisposition has already mitigated the worst of that sugar processing burden.
Okay, well, if we concede that his mind is his greatest asset, we still have to address the physical demands of human physiology. So let's move to contention 2, the efficacy of his non-traditional approach to physical maintenance. Buffett jokes about avoiding the physical wear and tear of excessive exercise, but relying solely on daily walks and brain games like bridge, it just seems insufficient to counter the chronic metabolic threats posed by his diet. Traditional cardiovascular and resistance exercise is necessary precisely because it regulates those metabolic pathways specifically by improving insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue that are disrupted by a high sugar intake.
That assumes that physical exertion must be the primary metric for systemic resilience. I would reframe his intense cognitive life as the primary and, for him, most effective source of resilience. The 5 to 6 hours he spends immersed in deep reading and strategic thinking, that is an intense mental workout requiring sustained concentration. This constant high-level processing fosters enhanced synaptic density, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. This is arguably a superior, higher-level prophylaxis against age-related decline than lifting weights would be for him.
But his body still needs that physical stimulus to manage the sugar load effectively. Physical activity increases the number of GLUT4 transporters on muscle cells, which lets them absorb glucose independently of insulin. How does reading 5 annual reports accomplish that essential biological function?
It addresses the systemic energy drain caused by stress. His intentional rejection of hustle culture is the key here. Bill Gates noted that Buffett keeps a shockingly open calendar. He avoids multitasking, which he believes degrades the quality of thought. This deliberate strategy, maintaining a light schedule and focusing entirely on core priorities, prevents the high-frequency urgency stress that drives systemic inflammation. And that ability to choose low stress, well, that is the ultimate privilege. It's not just having money, it's having the complete autonomy to optimize his entire environment for intellectual output, calm.
And that autonomy is the true luxury, isn't it? It's a direct byproduct of his financial success, which brings us right back to the role of privilege in sustaining this biological anomaly. His disciplined, low-stress life is only possible because he doesn't have the financial pressures or logistical nightmares that drive stress for the vast majority of people.
But the habit of rigorous focus and stress filtration is transferable, even if the scale of his success is not. It demonstrates that prioritizing cognitive challenge and systemic calm over the relentless pursuit of physical perfection or external validation can provide a profound physiological reward.
Well, let's look at the limits of his resilience by revisiting our third contention, the prostate cancer incident. His stage 1 prostate cancer diagnosis came at age 81, detected by a routine prostate-specific antigen, or PSA, test. This incident, I think, illuminates the reality of elite healthcare access and its controversial role in his longevity narrative.
And how does an early diagnosis weaken the case for his resilience?
Because his detection and subsequent treatment were against the established statistical norm for men his age. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, the USPSTF, explicitly recommends against routine PSA-based screening for men aged 70 and older. And why? They cite the risks of overdiagnosis, finding slow-growing cancers that would never cause harm, and the subsequent risks from unnecessary procedures. A biopsy, for instance, carries a 2 to 3% risk of serious infection, including sepsis.
So the guidelines suggest that for a population of 81-year-olds, the potential harms of aggressive testing outweigh the benefits.
Precisely. His diagnosis triggered strong criticism from prominent urologists because for a typical 81-year-old, the standard of care is often watchful waiting, given the expected low metastatic potential and short projected lifespan. This shows that Buffett benefited from aggressive screening, which was likely facilitated by his elite access to proactive diagnostics. His survival of cancer, while laudable, speaks not just to his robust health, but to the system that allowed him to bypass the statistical dangers inherent in those broad screening policies.
I acknowledge the critical controversy surrounding PSA screening for the general population over 70. However, we have to view this through the lens of personalized medicine. Buffett is not a statistically average 81-year-old. Given his unique genetic and behavioral profile, the 8 hours of sleep, the low stress, the expected longevity, His unique projected lifespan was significantly longer than the population mean.
A projection based on what? His 5 Cokes a day?
Based on his undeniable, persistent vitality and lack of prior systemic disease. For an individual projected to live healthily past 95, treating localized early-stage cancer becomes a rational, beneficial choice. He opted for proactive diagnosis and successfully completed 44 days of radiation. The fact that he's continued to thrive for 12 years since then proves that his individualized decision, backed by elite access to care, defied the broad age-based cutoffs that are designed to protect the average person from over-treatment. His case highlights the importance of individual patient autonomy and access tailored to unique biological expectations.
It proves that the very best healthcare can override population statistics, but that remains a feature of privilege, not a replicable behavior.
It proves that the best approach depends on personalized factors, not just rigid age-based rules, a perspective enabled by his financial position, yes, but executed by his disciplined mental fortitude.
So, to bring my side of the case home, Warren Buffett's case is a statistical mirage. While his vitality is undeniable, his specific dietary choices, the overwhelming sugar and sodium, the ultra-processed foods, they remain a public health hazard for virtually everyone else. Any attempt to replicate his longevity has to begin with acknowledging that he possesses a rare, perhaps generational, metabolic resilience that acts as a genetic firewall. His low-stress, high-autonomy existence is a luxurious byproduct of financial success, which allows him to prioritize intellectual focus and joy in a way that is simply unattainable for the majority.
And my core concern remains this. The truly transferable aspects of his life are not genetic, they are behavioral and cognitive. It's the unwavering commitment to intense intellectual challenge through deep reading and bridge. It's the strict discipline of 8 hours of sleep every night and the emotional clarity that comes from focusing on that inner scorecard. These habits demonstrate that optimizing mental and emotional health, achieving psychosocial homeostasis, can yield profound, life-extending results that successfully buffer the body, even when one's dietary compliance is, shall we say, imperfect.
I think regardless of whether we attribute his success to genes or to disciplined habits, the Buffett paradox forces a wonderfully complex discussion that moves us well beyond simplistic ideas about caloric restriction and exercise dogma.
I agree. It shows that longevity is a dynamic, highly personal interplay between our genetics, consistent behavioral discipline, and perhaps most importantly, the systematic optimization of one's mind and happiness. The material clearly suggests that mental well-being is a powerful protective physiological force that we are only just beginning to fully understand.